HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents A State of Freedom, a novel by Neel Mukherjee, read by Sartaj Garewal.
1. While trying to check the bill before settling, an old habit inculcated by his father of giving any bill the once over to see that he had not been overcharged, he realized that he had lost the ability to perform the simple function of adding up the individual items and the tax that together made up the grand total. Standing at the reception desk, he tried again and again. Then he took out his wallet and tried to count the rupee and US dollar notes nestled inside. He failed. Something as fundamental to intelligence as counting was eluding him. In the peripheries of his vision, he could see a small crowd gathering to look at him. Discreetly, nonchalantly, they thought. The news had spread. It was then that he broke down and wept for his son. He had hesitated about taking the boy to Fatehpur Sikri right after their lunchtime tour of the Taj Mahal. 2 major Mughal monuments in one afternoon could be considered excessive. But, he reasoned, it was less than an hour's drive, and to fit the 2 sites into one day was the generally accepted practice. They could be back at their hotel in Agra by early evening, and after an early night with a television and room service, they could leave for Delhi refreshed the following morning. The reasoning prevailed. When he mentioned part of this plan to the driver of his hired car, the young man, all longish hair and golden chain around his neck and golden wristlet and chunky watch, took it as a veiled order to go about the business in record time. He revelled in the opportunity to drive along the dusty, cratered slip road to Fatehpur Sikri at organ-jostling speed, punctuated by abrupt jerking into rest when impeded, and launching as suddenly into motion again. They passed a string of dingy roadside eateries, tea shops, cigarette and snacks shacks. The bigger ones boasted signboards and names. There were the predictable Akbar, Shah Jahan, Shehenshah, a Jodhabai, even a Tansen, which was 100% vegetarian. There had been a speed warning sign earlier, better late than never. Not for the first time he wondered, in a country given over to a dizzying plenitude of signs, how unsettled their orthography was. A Coca-Cola hoarding adorned the top of one small shop, the brand name and shout line written in Hindi script. "Coca-Cola!" the boy said, able to read that trademark universal wave even though he couldn't read the language. "We can have one after we've done our tour," he said, his mind occupied by trying to work out if another order to the driver to slow down to prevent the boy from being car sick would be taken as willfully contradictory. He worried about these things. The boy seemed subdued. He didn't move from the bare identification of the familiar brand to wanting it. Ordinarily, he would have been compulsively spelling out and trying to read the names written in English on shop fronts and billboards. While he was grateful for his son's uncharacteristic placidity, he wondered if he hadn't imposed too much on a 6-year-old, dragging him from one historical monument to another. He now read a kind of polite forbearance in the boy's quietness, a way of letting him know that this kind of tourism was wholly outside his sphere of interest, but he was going to tolerate his father indulging in it. After a few questions at the Taj Mahal, which began as enthusiastic, then quickly burned out into perfunctory, "Baba, what is a mausoleum? Is Mumtaz under this building? Was she walking and moving and talking when Shah Jahan built this over her?" They had stopped altogether. Was it wonder that had silenced him, or boredom? He had tried to keep the child interested by spinning stories that he thought would catch the boy's imagination. "Do you see how white the building is? Do you know that the emperor who had it built, Shah Jahan, had banquets on the terrace on full moon nights where everything was white? The moonlight, the clothes, the courtiers and the guests wore, the flowers, the food, everything was white, to go with the white of the marble and the white light of the full moon." The boy had nodded, seemingly absorbing the information, but had betrayed no further curiosity. Now he wondered if his son had not found all this business of tombs and immortal grief and erecting memorials to the dead macabre, unsettling. His son was American, so he was not growing up, as his father had, with the gift of ghost stories, first heard sitting on the laps of servants and aunts in his childhood home in Calcutta. Then, when he was a little older, read in children's books. As a result, he did not understand quite what went on inside the child's head, when novelties such as the notion of an order of things created by the imagination, residing under the visible world, and as vivid as the real one, were introduced to him. He made a mental note to stick to historical facts only when they reached Fatehpur Sikri. Or could it have been the terrible accident they had narrowly avoided witnessing yesterday at the moment of their arrival at the hotel? A huge multi-storied building was going up across the road, directly opposite, and a construction worker had apparently fallen to his death even while their car was getting into the slip lane for the hotel entrance. As they waited in the queue of vehicles, people had come running from all directions to congregate at one particular spot, about 20 meters from where they sat in their cars. Something about the urgency of the swarming and the indescribable sound that emanated from that swiftly engorging clot of people, a tense noise between buzzing and truculent murmuring, instantly transmitted the message that a disaster had occurred. Otherwise, how else would the child have known to ask, "Baba, people running! Look! What's happening there?" And how else could the driver have answered mercifully in Hindi, "A man's just fallen from the top of that building under construction. A mazdoor. Instant death, bachara." He had refused to translate. He had tried to pull his son back from craning his neck, but as the queue of cars moved and their vehicle moved forward, through a chance aperture in the hive of people around the death, he saw, for the briefest of flashes, a patch of dusty earth stained the color of old scab from the blood it had thirstily drunk. Then the slit closed, the car started advancing inch by inch, and the vision ended. He saw his son turning his head to continue to stare at the spot. But had the boy really seen the earth welt like that, or had he just imagined it? There was no way he could ask him to corroborate. Worries came stampeding in. Had the child seen it? Was he going to be affected by it? How could he establish if he had, without planting the idea in the boy's head? All of last night his mind had been a pincushion to these sharp questions until he had fallen asleep. They returned now, summoned by the boy's unnatural quietness. By the time they got out at Agra Gate, having shaved all of 10 minutes from the journey, the boy was looking decidedly peaky, and he felt that his own lunch had risen in rebellion to somewhere just behind his sternum. The driver grinned. There was just the right touch of the adversarial in the gleam of self-satisfaction. More than 20 years of life in the academic communities of the east coast of the USA had defanged him of the easy Indian ability to bark at people considered as servants, so he swallowed his irritation, even the intention to ask the driver to take it more gently on the journey back, in case he couldn't control the tone and it was interpreted as a peremptory order. Instead, he said in Hindi, "We won't be more than an hour." The driver said, "Okay, sir," nodding vigorously. "I will be here." He checked the car to see if he had taken everything: a bottle of water, his wallet and passport, the guidebook, his small backpack, his phone, his son's little knapsack, then shut the car door and held out his hand. The boy's meek silence bothered him. Where was the usual firework display of chatter and fidgety energy, the constant soundtrack of his aliveness? He knelt down to be on a level with the boy and asked tenderly, "Are you tired? Do you want to go back to the hotel? We don't have to see this." The boy shook his head. "Do you want a Parley's orange cream?" he asked, widening and rolling his eyes to simulate the representation of temptation in the advertisements. The boy shook his head again. Behind him on a grass verge, a hoopoe was flitting across. He said, "Look!" and turned the boy round. The boy looked dutifully but didn't ask what it was. "It's a hoopoe! You won't see this bird in New York." He supplied the answer gratuitously. The boy asked, "Is this a mausoleum?" No, sweetheart, his father laughed. It's not a mausoleum. It's a palace. You know what a palace is, don't you? A very good and powerful king lived here. His name was Akbar. I told you about him last night, remember? That was Shah Jahan, who built a big marble stone on his wife, and she died, and he was very sad and cried all the time. Every time he spoke, the American accent made his father's insides go all squishy. No, this is different. Akbar was his grandfather. Come, we'll look at it. It's a different color, see? All red and brown and orange, not the white that we saw earlier. They passed some ruined cloisters, then a triple-arched inner gateway, solidly restored, and slightly further from it, a big domed building that was awaiting restoration work. Touts who had noticed a man and a small boy get out of the car descended on them. Guide, sir? Guide? Good English, sir? Full history you won't find in book. Not from one voice, but from an entire choir. Beggars with various forms of crippledness materialized. From the simplest pleading, with a hand repeatedly brought up to the lips to signify hunger, to hideous displays of amputated and bandaged limbs, even an inert, entirely limbless, alive torso laid out flat on a board with wheels. This extreme end of the spectrum of human agony filled him with horror, shame, pity, embarrassment, repulsion, but, above all, a desire to protect his son from seeing them. How did all these other people drifting around him appear to be so sheathed in indifference and blindness? Or was the same churning going on inside them? Truth was, he felt, he was no longer a proper Indian. Making a life in the plush West had made him skinless like a good sheltered first-world liberal. He was now a tourist in his own country. No longer his own country, he corrected himself fastidiously. He suppressed the impulse to cover the boy's eyes with his hands and said impatiently, "Sweetie, can we move a bit faster, please?" It came out as a command, the interrogative missing. Men came up with accordions of postcards, maps, guidebooks, magazines, photos, toys, current bestsellers in pirated editions, snacks, rattles, drinks, confectionery, tinsel, dolls, plastic replicas of historical buildings, books, whistles, and flutes. He kept shaking his head stoically, a tight half-smile on his lips, and ushered his boy along. The child, distracted one moment by a tray of carved soapstone figures, then another instant by a flashing, crudely copied replica of an inflatable Superman toy, kept stalling to stare. "Baba, Baba, look!" "Yes, I know. Let's keep moving." He was so relieved and grateful that the cheap toys had diverted the child's attention away from the suppuration and misery that he almost broke step to buy one of those baubles. That small manifestation of interest was enough. The loose, dispersed assembly of touts and peddlers now tightened into a purposeful circle. "Babu, my child is hungry, hasn't eaten for 4 days." The shriveled girl with matted hair in the woman's arms looked like the living dead. She had no energy or will to swipe at the flies clustering on a sore at the corner of her mouth. "Hey, look, Babu! Babu Saab, look!" A button was pressed and a toy came to mechanical life, emitting tinny games arcade sounds of shooting guns as it teetered forward. A man came up uncomfortably close, and with the dexterity of a seasoned card sharp, fanned open a deck of sepia prints of famous Indian historical buildings and temples. A picture of a naked woman appeared and disappeared so quickly that it could well have been the prestidigitator's illusion. He was shocked. Didn't the man see that he had a small child with him, or did he not care? The surrounding gardens, well tended by Indian standards, shone in the white-gold light of the January afternoon. Yet, looked at closely, all that riot of cannas and marigolds and manicured grass lawns could not really disguise their irredeemable municipal souls. There was the typical shoddiness, straggly borders, lines that could not keep straight, a certain patchiness to the planting, revealing the scalp of soil through the thinning hair of vegetation, the inevitable truculence of nature against the methodizing human hand. And, underpinning all this amateurish attempt at imposing order and beauty, he could feel, no, almost see, what a battle it was to keep the earth, wet and dark now, from reverting to red dust in the obliterating heat of the northern plains in the summer. He bought tickets and entered the great courtyard of the Diwani Arm. The world transformed. In the burnished gold of the winter afternoon sun, the umber-red sandstone used for the whole complex at Fatehpur Sikri seemed like carved fire, something the sun had magicked out of the red soil in their combined image and likeness. He looked at his son, expecting to see a reflection of his own wonder on the child's face, but all he could discern in that mostly unreadable expression was what? Boredom? Across another courtyard, all blazing copper in the light, lay the palace buildings. He backtracked to consult the map etched onto a stone block towards the entrance, but with no reference point to indicate, "You are here," he felt confused. While retrieving the camera and the guidebook from his backpack, he said to his son, "Stay still for a moment, don't run off. We'll go to all those beautiful little palaces, do you see?" By the time he had slung the camera around his neck and opened the guidebook to the correct page, he could tell that the boy was itching to run across the courtyard. He tried to keep an eye on him while skim-reading the relevant page. Yes, he had found it. This must be the Mahali Khas, the private palaces of Akbar. His head bobbed back and forth like a foraging bird's from page to surrounding environment. When he had established beyond any doubt that the 2.5-storied building on the left, which had a touch of incompleteness to it, was Akbar's private apartments, he caught hold of his son's hand and made to enter the building. But he had been spotted leafing through the travel guide, his hesitation and momentary lostness read shrewdly. A man materialized behind him and began to speak as if he was in the middle of a talk he had been giving. "The recesses in the ground floor that you will see were meant for his books and papers and documents." He wheeled around. The sun caught his eyes and dazzled him. All he could make out was a dark, almost black, sharply pointed face, a human face on its way to becoming a fox's, or was it the other way round? "If you go up to his sleeping chamber, the Kwabga, on the top floor," the man continued, "you will see fine stone lattice-work screens along the corridor leading to the women's quarters, the harem. These jallis protected the women from the public gaze as they went back and forth from the Kwabga." The man spoke with practiced fluency. If he was trying to advertise his skills as a guide to get hired, then there was nothing in his manner or his speech that betrayed this purposive bent. If anything, he seemed almost oblivious of his presence and his child's. The sun had blinded him, so he turned his head away, both to face his son, whom he was afraid to let out of his field of vision for any duration, and to signal to the man that he was not going to be needing his services. The buildings that lay in the slanted shade were an earthen matte pink. Elsewhere, the red sandstone that caught the sun burned a coppery gold. When he turned around to see if he had shaken off the tout, there was no one to be seen. In the rooms on the ground floor of the Emperor's private quarters, he was held by the flaky painted decorations depicting flowers and foliage. These faded ghosts still managed to carry a fraction of their original life spirit. They had been touched up, restored, but with a brutal mugger's hand. From the vantage point of the courtyard, the interior had looked poky and pitch dark, and he had wondered about the smallness of the chambers, and, correspondingly, the physical stature of those 16th-century people. Did they have to huddle and stoop inside? Was it light enough to see things in there during the daytime? Why were there no doors and windows? What did they do for privacy? And then, the crowning question, did he know just too little about the architectural and domestic history of the Mughals? Now that they were inside, the idea that the rooms were cramped somewhat diminished, but the feeling that they were, or could be, dark remained. Was it something to do with his vision, or from having just come in from the brightness outside? He blinked several times. The interior seemed to shrink, expand, and then shrink again, as if he were in the almost imperceptibly pulsating belly of a giant beast. In the pavilion at the top, where Akbar used to sleep, faded frescoes nibbled away by time with a slow but tenacious voracity covered the walls. But the fragments seemed to be under some kind of wash. A protective varnish, perhaps, but it had the effect of occluding them under a milky mist. A winged creature holding an infant in front of a cave in a rock face looked down at him from above a doorway. It looked as if it had been assembled from large flakes of once-colored dandruff. His heart boiled against the cage of his chest. "Baba, look, an angel!" the child said. He closed his eyes, gripped his son's hand, turned his face away, then back again, and opened his eyes. The angel continued to stare at him. There was intent in those eyes, and even the very first touch of a smile in those delicately upturned corners, as if Persian artists had brought forth a Chinese angel. He shut his eyes again. The face of the fox guide, accompanied by shifting confetti links of floaters, flickered across his retina. Outside, the courtyard, large enough to be the central square in a city where the crowd congregates for the beginning of a revolution, held scattered groups of colorfully clothed visitors. The spiky phalanx of red canners blazed in their plots. A square stone platform, bordered by jallis, rose from the center of a square rectangular pool filled with stagnant water, virulent green with algae. 4 raised narrow walkways, bisecting each side of the square, led to the platform. The musical rigor that the Mughals had brought to the quadrangular form struck him again. He riffled through his guidebook to read something illuminating about this pool, Anup Talao. "Baba, can we go to the middle? There are lanes," the boy said. "I don't think we are allowed to," he said, then tried to distract him by summarizing the few lines on the feature. "Look, it says here that musicians used to sit in the center there on that platform and perform concerts for the emperor and his court." After a few beats of silence, he added, "Wasn't that interesting?" hearing his own need to keep the boy engaged, fraying with exhaustion. "Why aren't we allowed to?" "Well," he thought for a second or two, "if people were allowed in, we would see a lot of tourists here walking in and out, posing on the platform, taking pictures, but there's none of that, do you see?" It was better outside. The relative darkness inside had, oddly, unnerved him. But the pressure of tourism was relentless, bullying. Surely they hadn't come all this way to stand in the sun and look at pretty buildings from a distance when they could be inside them, poring over the details, going into every room of every palace, absorbing what the guidebook had to say about each, and then re-looking, armed with new knowledge. In the strange and beautiful 5-storied Panch Mahal, each ascending floor diminishing in size until there was only a small kiosk surmounted by a dome on top, 84, 56, 20, 12, and 4 columns on each level, respectively, his guide told him. Arches between columns took the place of walls, and he had been glad of the light and the breeze that came in unimpeded. Outside once again, he noticed the squares marked on the courtyard with a raised stone seat at the center of the regular cross formed by the squares, and pointed them out to his son. "Do you see the squares in the 4 directions, making the 4 arms of a big plus sign?" he asked, tapping a few with his feet and indicating the rest with his pointing hand. "Here, and this, do you see?" The boy nodded. "Show me the plus sign, then," he asked. The child danced around, stamping on each square, repeating his father's, "Here, and this one." "Good," he said. "Do you know what they are for?" "This square has X on it, and this one," the boy said, jumping on each of them. "Yes, so they do. Do you know what these squares are doing here?" The boy shook his head and looked at him expectantly. "This is a board game like Ludo or chess. It's called Pachisi, like Ludo or chess. It's called Pachisi. Instead of having a small board at the center which is surrounded by a circle of a few players, they had a big one marked out permanently in this courtyard." His son stared silently as if digesting the information. "But do you know why it's so big? I mean, so much bigger than a Ludo or a chessboard." He was hoping the child was not going to ask what Ludo was. Why should the ubiquitous board game of the endless afternoons and evenings of his Calcutta childhood mean anything to an American boy? That worn question of his son's disconnection with his father's culture reared its head again, but weakly. He pushed it down, easily enough, and offered the answer to the question he had asked by reading an excerpt from a 19th-century book quoted in his travel guide. The game of Pachisi was played by Akbar in a truly regal manner, the court itself divided into red and white squares being the board, and an enormous stone raised on 4 feet representing the central point. It was here that Akbar and his courtiers played this game. 16 young slaves from the harem, wearing the players' colors, represented the pieces and moved to the squares according to the throw of dice. It is said that the emperor took such a fancy to playing the game on this grand scale that he had a court for Pachisi constructed in all his palaces. Again, that expression of wide-eyed nothingness on the boy's face. He explained the quotation slowly, in simple words, pointing to the squares and the stone seat to spark some interest in the boy. The child's face lit up for an instant. He hopped from one square to another, then another, finally sat cross-legged on one of them and chirped, "Am I a piece in this game?" "You could be," he laughed. "What will happen when you throw the die? Will my head be chopped off in one clean stroke?" Before he could answer, a voice behind him intervened sharply. "Get that child out of that square!" He wheeled around. It was the man with the face of a fox. His eyes glittered. The moustache looked animal too. "Don't you know it's bad luck to have children sit in these squares? Do you know what happened here? Don't you know the stories?" He was sufficiently annoyed by the man's hectoring tone to protest. "Show me a sign that says children are not allowed on this board. It's part of the courtyard. Anyone can walk on it. And who are you, anyway?" "Look around you. Do you see any children?" Almost involuntarily, he turned around. To his right, the extraordinary symmetry of the detached building of the Diwani Khas. Behind him, the jewel box of the Turkish Sultana's house. And in the huge courtyard on which these structures stood, not a single child to be spotted. All those colourfully dressed tourists he had seen earlier seemed to have vanished. There were one or two to be seen standing in the shapely arches of buildings or colonnaded walkways, but there was no one in the courtyard and certainly no children. Incredulous, he turned a full circle to be sure he had let his gaze take in everything. No children. The man, too, was gone. There was a sudden brief vacuum in his chest. Then the sensation left. Did you see the man who was just here? Where did he go?" he asked his son. The boy shook his head. But you saw him speaking to me, didn't you?" He was nearly shouting. "Speaking? What?" the boy asked. Of course, the child wouldn't have understood a word. The man had been speaking in Hindi. But, he began. Then that futility was inside him again, making him feel weightless. He extended his hand to his son and caught the warm little palm and fingers in his grip and wanted to hold on to them to moor himself, and at the same to scrunch them, so fierce was the wave of love and terror that suddenly threatened to unbalance him. He took the boy and ran into the Turkish Sultana's house, but was blind to the ways craftsmen had made every available surface blossom into teeming life with dense carvings of gardens, trees, leaves, flowers, geometric patterns, birds, animals, abstract designs. At another time he would have been rooted to the spot, marvelling, but now his senses were disengaged and distant, and all he saw was the frozen work of artisans and their tools. In one of the lower panels, the heads of the birds of paradise sitting on trees had been destroyed. An animal crouching below had been defaced too, making it look much like the lower half of a human child, decapitated in the act of squatting. It brought to mind ritual sacrifice. A small thrill of repulsion went through him. The mutilated carvings had the nature of fantastical creatures from Bosch's sick imagination. Left untouched, they would have been simply beautiful. Then the dimness started to play havoc with his perception. Shapes and colors got unmoored and recoalesced in different configurations. It was like discovering a camel smoking a pipe formed in clouds in the sky.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?